9 years. 9 years I slept beside a man I believed loved me. 9 years I gave him everything, my trust, my love, and my soul. But tonight, in this towering penthouse in Manhattan, I hear him whisper the name of my best friend, and I realize this marriage was never real. He doesn't love me. He's preparing to erase me from his life. And worst of all, he thinks I'll never know. If you're reading this story, please like and comment the city you're in so I know how far my story has progressed. Stay tuned to the end, because this is the story of a woman betrayed by the two people closest to her, and how she rises to reclaim it all. The rain came in sideways that night, dragging itself across the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 53rd floor like something trying to get inside. Sienna Vale stood at the kitchen island in bare feet, a half-eaten bowl of leftover rice going cold beside her laptop, reading the same sentence in a surgical journal for the 4th time without absorbing a single word. She was tired, not the kind of tired that a night's sleep fixes, the kind that lives in the back of your jaw and behind your eyes and makes everything feel slightly off-center, like the world has been nudged 2 degrees to the left and never corrected. She'd been on her feet for 14 hours. A 26-year-old construction worker had come in through the ER doors at 6 in the morning with a rebar through his abdomen, missed the aorta by a centimeter, and Sienna had spent the next 4 hours doing what she was trained to do, making her hands steady when everything around her was chaos. She'd saved him. She always saved them. That was the thing about her job. You showed up, you cut, you held the bleeding shut with your own 2 hands, and most of the time the person on the table walked out of the hospital alive. Her marriage had never felt that simple. She pushed the journal aside and reached for her cold coffee. Damien's voice drifted through the hallway from the study, low, unhurried, the particular cadence he used when he was charming someone. She'd learned to recognize the different registers of his voice the way she'd learned to read a monitor. There was the voice he used in boardrooms, the voice he used at dinner parties, when he touched the small of her back and smiled at their guests, the voice he used when he wanted something from her without asking directly. She didn't think much about it. She pulled her laptop toward her and started typing notes, and then she heard the sound. A faint, soft ping from the tablet propped against the fruit bowl. Her tablet. Not his. She almost ignored it. She should have ignored it. Instead, she looked down and saw it. An active call notification mirrored from Damien's phone through the Bluetooth relay they'd set up 2 years ago so she could take his calls when he was in surgery prep and she needed to screen his schedule. He'd never disconnected the mirror. She'd never thought about it until this moment. The call was live. She could hear his voice clearly now, no longer muffled by the hallway wall. She reached for the tablet slowly, like something in her already knew. "You've been patient," Damien said. "I know it's been hard." The other voice was a woman's, soft, familiar in a way that made Sienna's stomach clench before her brain caught up. "It's been 2 years, Damien." Clara. Sienna's hand stopped moving. Clara Whitmore. Her closest friend since residency. The woman who had held her when her father died. Who had flown across the country twice to sit beside her in hospital waiting rooms. Who knew how she took her coffee. Who was listed as her emergency contact because there had been a stretch of years when Sienna had trusted her more than anyone alive. 2 years, Damien repeated, and his voice carried something Sienna had never heard in it before. Indulgence, almost. The warmth of a man speaking to someone he doesn't need to perform for. "And you'll have everything. Soon you won't be my secret anymore. You'll be my wife." The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the rain hit the glass. Sienna did not move. She was a trauma surgeon. She had learned through years of brutal training to separate what she felt from what she had to do in a given moment. On the table, when someone was bleeding out, she did not have the luxury of shock. You acknowledged the data, you recalibrated, and you acted. She understood, on some clinical level, that what she was hearing was restructuring everything she believed about her life. She understood this the way you understand that a bone is broken before the pain has finished traveling to your brain. She did not make a sound. "She doesn't suspect anything?" Claire's voice. Quiet. Almost careful. "Sienna?" A pause. A low, almost affectionate exhale. "She suspects nothing. She works 80 hours a week and comes home exhausted. She trusts me. That's the problem with her, actually. She always has. Sienna stared at the rain on the window. The journals, Clara said. I pulled everything you asked for. 3 years of entries. I made copies before I returned the notebook to her shelf. The journals. For a moment, Sienna couldn't locate the reference in her mind. Then it landed. The leather-bound journals she kept in the bottom drawer of her nightstand, the private writing she'd started after her father's death, at the suggestion of a therapist she'd seen for 11 months. She'd written in them when she couldn't sleep, processing grief, self-doubt, the ugly private confessions that a person makes only to themselves. The times she'd wondered if she was capable of being loved. The times the pressure of the hospital had cracked her open and she'd written things down just to keep them from circling her skull at 3 a.m. She had told Clara about them once, shown her a single passage, trusted her with the existence of something private. That's enough? Clara asked. Combined with the right narrative? Damien's voice was measured now, professional. The boardroom register bleeding in. More than enough. Her own words describing emotional instability, difficulty managing stress, unresolved grief. We present it correctly, with the right legal framing, and any judge would question her capacity to manage a significant inheritance. Sienna's breath went shallow. Her father's estate. The portfolio of assets he'd left her at his death 18 months ago. Real estate holdings, investments, a trust that had been accumulating value for 30 years. She'd never touched the principal. She hadn't needed to. She had her salary, her own accounts, her own carefully built financial independence. The inheritance sat there, managed by attorneys, while she'd spent the past year and a half just trying to grieve her father without falling apart. Once the competency proceeding establishes doubt, Damien continued, we move to the divorce filing simultaneously. Contested. She'll be fighting on 2 fronts, confused, under public pressure. Her reputation at the hospital will be next. She has allies there. She has colleagues. There's a difference. A brief silence. Clara, do you trust me? A pause that lasted exactly 2 seconds. Yes. Then let me handle the sequence. The gathering at Whitfield's in 6 weeks, that's when I want to announce. That gives us enough time to have the initial filing ready, the media contact prepared, and the evidence package in her attorney's hands before she has any idea what's coming. His voice softened again. You've waited long enough. I promise. The call ended. The tablet screen dimmed. Sienna sat very still on her kitchen stool with her cold coffee in her hand and the rain coming sideways against the glass and the refrigerator humming its indifferent hum. And she breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The way she breathed when her hands were inside someone's chest and the monitors were screaming and she could not afford to be anything other than present and controlled and absolutely functional. She did not cry. She would not cry. Not here, not now, not where he might hear her. Instead, she thought, she was 38 years old. She had spent half her adult life inside hospitals, learning to read situations that changed in seconds, learning to predict the ways bodies failed and the ways they survived. She knew how to assess damage. She knew how to triage. She knew, more than almost anyone, how to look at something broken and calculate what could still be saved. She set the coffee down, picked up the tablet, checked the call log. The mirror connection had captured 43 seconds of audio before the call dropped from Damien's end. 43 seconds. Not enough to record anything, but enough. She replayed it in her head with the precision of someone who spent their professional life making critical decisions on incomplete information. She heard Clara's voice. I pulled everything you asked for. 3 years of entries. Her private journals. In Clara's hands. Copied. She heard Damien's voice. She trusts me. That's the problem with her, actually. 9 years. She thought about their first date. A gallery opening in Soho, Damien in a charcoal suit, easy and unhurried, the kind of man who moved through rooms like he expected them to accommodate him. She had found that confidence attractive then. She had been 29, fresh out of her fellowship, good at her job but uncertain about most other things, and Damien had seemed like a fixed point in a world that kept moving too fast. He had been patient with her grief when her mother died, patient when the hospital politics got brutal and she came home short-tempered and silent. Patient when she admitted she had a therapist, when she admitted she kept journals, when she admitted she was afraid sometimes, that she wasn't built for the kind of sustained intimacy that a real marriage required. He had used every single one of those admissions. She got off the stool without making noise, crossed the kitchen in the dark, moved down the hallway toward the study. The door was partly open. She could see Damien's profile, the clean line of his jaw, the expensive angle of his haircut, his hand resting on the desk as he scrolled through something on his phone. He looked, in that moment, exactly like the man she had married. That was the thing she'd have to live with for a long time. He looked exactly the same. There was no visible sign, no tell she should have caught. She had spent 9 years looking at him. She had not seen it. She pushed the door open. He looked up. His face arranged itself into the expression she knew, warm, a little tired, the face of a man who was glad his wife had come to find him. "Hey," he said. "Thought you were asleep." "I was reading," she said. Her voice was level. She was aware of her own breathing. In the hallway behind her, 43 seconds of audio lived in the tablet's mirror log, and she was standing in front of the man who had planned her destruction with the measured precision of someone laying a board meeting agenda. "You should sleep," he said. "You had a long shift."
I know.
She looked at him, at the desk, at the neat stack of papers at his left hand, the closed laptop, the glass of whiskey with the ice already melted. She looked at him the way she looked at an X-ray, not for what was visible, but for what the shadow behind the visible thing revealed. "I'm going to bed. I'll be there in a bit." She nodded, turned, walked back down the hallway. In the bedroom, she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. She did not turn the light on. She reached down and pulled out the bottom drawer of her nightstand, slowly, without sound. Her fingers found the leather spine of the journal. She pulled it out and held it in her lap. She hadn't written in it in 4 months. She thought she was getting better. She thought the grief was finally starting to metabolize into something quieter. She opened it to the last entry, though she couldn't read it in the dark, and she ran her thumb along the page and thought about her father. Marcus Vale. A man who had built something real from nothing, who had taught her that the only power worth having was the kind you built yourself, that no one could take what you understood about yourself. He had died in this city, in the hospital where she worked, and she had not been able to save him, and she had written about that failure in these pages in words so raw she had never shown them to anyone. Except she had shown Clara that one passage, the one about the night he died. She closed the journal, held it against her chest. 9 years. She thought, he planned this, not impulsively, not out of some sudden desire. He had planned this with the patience of a man who understood long games. He had married her with a destination already in mind. And Clara had not been seduced into this recently. 2 years, she'd said. You've been patient. 2 years of lying to her face, attending her birthday, crying with her at her father's funeral, holding her hand in the cemetery while internally calculating the value of the estate behind the grief. A different woman might have walked back into that study and confronted him, thrown something, screamed. Sienna had spent 14 years in trauma medicine. She knew that the worst mistakes came when people acted on the first wave of adrenaline. The rebar in the abdomen looked fatal until you slowed down and looked at the anatomy. The thing that looked like the main bleed was sometimes the distraction. She needed to think. She needed to be exact. She slid the journal into her overnight bag, which sat on the chair beside the dresser. She covered it with a sweater. She lay down on top of the covers in her clothes and stared at the ceiling in the dark, while the rain worked itself against the glass, and she began to plan. Not a reaction, a response. There was a difference. In the morning, Damien left early for what he said was a breakfast meeting in Midtown. He kissed her forehead at 6:15 while she lay still with her eyes closed, and she listened to the sound of his footsteps and the soft mechanical exhale of the front door closing, and she waited exactly 4 minutes before she got up. She moved through the apartment differently than she had the night before. She looked at it like a room she was seeing for the first time. The penthouse had been his before they married. He'd kept it in his name. She'd never thought to question it. She had her own place she'd let go of because she trusted him, and that decision now sat in her chest like a small, hard stone. Everything in this apartment was his, the art on the walls, the furniture, the address. She went to his desk. She wasn't looking for anything specific. Not yet. She didn't have a list. What she had was instinct. The same instinct that told her when a patient's stable presentation was concealing something systemic and dangerous. Something is wrong beneath the surface. Look for the structures. His desk drawer held the expected: pens, a spare phone charger, a small leather notebook. She opened the notebook. Most of it was abbreviations and numbers she didn't recognize. Initials beside dollar figures, dates without context. She photographed every page with her phone, working fast and without panic, returning things to their exact positions the way she'd replaced instruments on a surgical tray for 15 years. The second drawer held documents, a manila folder labeled in his handwriting Estate 5. She stared at that label for a long moment. Then she opened it. The papers inside were preliminary. Drafts, she thought, not signed filings. But they were legal documents. Her name appeared on the second page beneath the header: Competency Assessment, Initial Review. And below it, a summary that described her, in careful legal language, as someone whose judgment had been compromised by unresolved grief, emotional volatility, and an inability to make sound decisions under sustained stress. Below that, a list of citations. Source documents. The journal entries were there, not quoted directly, but referenced. Personal written records provided by secondary source. Secondary source: Clara. Sienna replaced the folder exactly as she had found it. She closed the drawer. She stood with her hands flat on the desktop for a moment, looking out the rain-streaked window at the gray Manhattan morning. She thought, how long have you had this ready? She thought about the conversation she'd had with Damien about her father's estate over the past year and a half. The gentle suggestions about moving funds, updating the trust structure, bringing in new advisors. She deferred to him because she was busy, because she was grieving, because she trusted him. The advisors he'd recommended. She pulled those names from memory now and wondered how deeply those threads ran, whether they'd been reporting to him, whether the entire scaffolding of her financial life had been quietly compromised while she stood in operating theaters, putting people back together. She left the study, went back to the bedroom, sat on the bed, called the one person she could trust. The line rang twice. "It's 6:30 in the morning," said Dr. Nora Chen, her oldest colleague and the only person at the hospital whose loyalty she would bet her life on. "I know, I need to talk to you, in person, not here." A pause. Nora had known her for 12 years. She heard the register of Sienna's voice and did not ask unnecessary questions. "When?" "An hour, the coffee place on West 72nd. "I'll be there." Sienna hung up. She changed her clothes. She took her overnight bag, the journal inside it, and slung it over her shoulder. She walked out of the bedroom, through the apartment that was not hers, past the art she had never particularly liked, to the front door. She paused with her hand on the door handle. Behind her, the apartment sat quiet and clean and expensive, and somewhere in that study was a folder with her name on it and a plan to dismantle her life through her own private words. She thought, "You wanted to control the story, so did I." She opened the door and walked out into the corridor. And for the first time in 9 years, Sienna Vale was not the woman who trusted everyone she loved. She was the woman who had stopped trusting and started watching. In the elevator going down, her phone buzzed. A message from Clara. "Hey, free for lunch this week? Miss you." Sienna read it once. Typed back. "Absolutely. Let's do Thursday." She hit send and dropped the phone into her bag and watched the floor numbers descend, and her face was perfectly still, and her jaw was set, and somewhere beneath the stillness, the cold, precise part of her that had always known how to survive was already calculating exactly how deep this went and exactly how far she was willing to go to survive it. The elevator reached the lobby. She walked out into the rain. She didn't know yet that the name in that legal folder wasn't the worst thing she'd find, that behind the drafted documents and the copied journals and the quiet 2-year affair, there was a layer of Damien Voss that made everything she'd discovered in the last 12 hours look like the surface of something vast and dark and structured the way criminal things are structured, from the inside out, by someone who had been building it for decades and had never once expected to be found. She didn't know that yet, but she was about to start learning. The coffee place on West 72nd was the kind of establishment that had survived 3 recessions and 2 pandemics by being unremarkable in every visible way. Narrow, slightly dim, with booths whose vinyl had been repaired so many times the patches had their own patches. Sienna had been coming here since her residency. Nobody who knew Damien Voss would ever set foot in it. She was on her second cup when Nora arrived, shaking rain from her coat, scanning the room with the quick clinical sweep of someone trained to assess environments for threats. Nora Chen was 51 years old, 5'3", and had the particular kind of stillness that came from having seen enough genuine emergencies to know the difference between chaos and catastrophe. She slid into the booth across from Sienna and looked at her face and said nothing for a moment. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't." "How bad?" Sienna put her hands flat on the table. Her nails were short, practical, unpolished, a surgeon's hands. She watched them like they belonged to someone else. "I need you to tell me if I'm reading this wrong," she said. "I need you to push back if you think I am." "Okay?" "Because I don't trust my own judgment right now, and that is not something I say." "I know it isn't." Nora ordered coffee from the server without looking up. "Talk." Sienna talked. She laid it out the way she presented a case. Sequential, factual, stripping emotion from the structure even when the content was designed to wreck her. The phone call. The 43 seconds. Clara's voice. The folder in the desk drawer with her name under competency assessment. The journal entries Clara had copied. The name of the attorney on the draft documents. A man named Hargrove, whose firm she'd looked up on her phone in the elevator and found to specialize, exclusively, in high-asset contested divorce proceedings. She talked for 9 minutes. Nora did not interrupt once. When Sienna stopped, Nora sat with her coffee cup in both hands and her eyes somewhere in the middle distance, and the silence between them was the kind that meant someone was processing rather than preparing a response. "The legal draft," Nora said finally. "How complete did it look?" "Complete enough that someone had been working on it for a while. The language was specific. It cited her emotional history, her treatment records." She stopped. "Or what could be presented as treatment records. I saw a therapist for 11 months. I signed intake forms. I never thought about who else might have access." "Did Damien know the name of your therapist?" Sienna closed her eyes for half a second. "I told him, 3 years ago. I thought—" She stopped again. "I thought I was being open." Nora made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite sympathy. It was the sound of someone connecting architecture. "And the estate advisors he recommended. Do you know who they report to?" "Not yet." "That's the first thing you need to know." Nora set her cup down. "Before you do anything else, before you talk to a lawyer, before you confront anyone, before you change a single thing in that apartment, you need to know how far the financial piece goes, because if he's been inside your inheritance for longer than you think, the accounts may already have exposure." "I have my own accounts. Separate." "Separate how?" Sienna paused. She thought about the joint advisory structure Damien had suggested 2 years ago, not for their personal accounts, just for the estate trust, just to make the management more efficient, he'd said. She had signed something. She remembered signing something on a Saturday morning in this city, at a notary's office, while thinking about a patient she'd left in the ICU the night before. The look on her face told Nora everything. "Okay," Nora said. She didn't say "I told you so" because she hadn't, and she wasn't that kind of woman. "We're going to be methodical about this. Start with what you can verify independently." She paused. "Is there anyone inside his business you've ever actually spoken to? Not through him? Directly?" "His assistant, Theo. I've met him maybe a dozen times at events." "Does Theo seem like someone who might be unhappy?" Sienna thought about Theo Park. Thin, precise, with the nervous energy of someone perpetually calculating the distance between himself and the nearest exit. She'd noticed it at their last dinner event 3 months ago. He'd excused himself twice to take calls and come back both times with something different behind his eyes. She'd filed it away and forgotten it. She said, "Possibly." "Then you start there." Nora looked at her directly. "Sienna, I have to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly." "Yes." "Is there any part of this, any part, that you think you might be misreading? Because grief does things to perception. I'm not dismissing what you heard. I'm asking if there is any other interpretation." Sienna held her gaze. He said her name. He said, "You'll be my wife." She said she'd copied 3 years of my journals. There is no other interpretation. Nora nodded once. That was enough. They sat for another 20 minutes, working through what Sienna had and what she needed. By the time she walked out of the coffee shop and back into the rain, she had a list in her head that she would not write down anywhere. Not yet, not in any medium that could be accessed. She had learned something in the last 12 hours about what it meant to leave traces. She went to the hospital. She went because she had rounds, because disappearing from her routine would signal something she wasn't ready to signal, and because the hospital was the one place in the world where she still understood exactly who she was and what she was capable of. She changed into scrubs in the attendings lounge, stood at the sink, and looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. She looked the same. That was the disorienting part. She looked exactly like she had yesterday and the day before. Whatever had shifted inside her in the last 8 hours had not yet reached her face. Good. She went to rounds. She checked on 3 post-ops. She reviewed charts, answered questions from the residents, handled a consult on a 44-year-old who'd come in overnight with internal bleeding from a blunt impact. A fall, the ER note said, though the bruising pattern told a different story that wasn't hers to pursue today. She did her job. She did it well. And the entire time, beneath the competence and the clinical language and the practiced calm, her mind was running a parallel track. She thought about the name Hargrove. She thought about what it meant that a divorce attorney had already been engaged, not consulted, but engaged, with draft filings prepared. That wasn't a man considering his options. That was a man with a timeline. She thought about Clara's voice. 2 years, Damien. 2 years ago, Sienna's father had been diagnosed with the illness that would eventually kill him. She had spent that stretch of time moving between the hospital and her parents' apartment in the West Village, absorbing the particular slow-motion devastation of watching a strong person diminish. Clara had been with her through all of it, calling, visiting, sitting across from her in restaurants and saying the right things, while sleeping with her husband, while planning. She was between consults, standing at a nurse's station reviewing an imaging report, when her phone buzzed. A text from Damien. "Dinner tonight? Thinking the place on Park." "We haven't been in a while." She read it twice. She thought about the casual precision of it. "We haven't been in a while." The performance of a man who thought he was managing a schedule, not a person who was beginning to understand his entire architecture. She typed back, "Sounds good. 7?" His reply came in 4 seconds. "Perfect. Love you." She dropped the phone into her coat pocket and went back to the imaging report, and did not feel anything she could have named in that moment because she was operating on a level below feeling, in the mechanical substrate where decisions are made before emotions arrive to complicate them. At 3 in the afternoon, she found Theo Park. She had not planned it exactly. She'd been thinking about how to approach him for days, which she didn't have, and then she turned a corner in the hospital lobby on her way to the parking structure and found him standing near the main entrance, looking at his phone with the focused expression of a man waiting for something unpleasant to happen. She almost walked past. She stopped. "Theo." He looked up. His expression went through 3 things in under a second: surprise, calculation, and then a careful pleasantness that didn't reach his eyes. "Dr. Vales. Hi. I didn't know you had anyone here." "I don't." A beat. "I had a meeting nearby. Thought I'd grab coffee." He was lying. She didn't know about what, but she recognized the quality of the lie, the kind that's technically true in every detail while meaning something entirely different. She'd learned to recognize that quality in the past 24 hours. She looked at him steadily. "How are things at the firm?" "Fine." Too fast. Damien mentioned a new project, something in the financial sector. He looked at her then, really looked, the calculation dropping slightly behind his eyes, something else coming forward. He said carefully, "He mentioned that to you?" "He's mentioned a few things." She paused. Let it sit. "I was wondering if you'd want to have coffee sometime. Catch up. We've never really talked, just us." She watched him process it. She watched him trying to figure out what she knew and whether she knew it, and whether this was a test or an approach or something else entirely. She could see it happening behind his face. He said, "Sure, yeah, I'd like that. I'll text you." She smiled. She had learned at some point in the last 24 hours that her smile was a tool. "Good to see you, Theo." She walked away and did not look back. That evening, she dressed for dinner with the automatic efficiency of someone whose mind is entirely elsewhere. She wore the dark blue dress Damien had bought her 2 Christmases ago, because wearing it was a data point, a signal that she was normal, unchanged, fully present in the life he believed he was still controlling. She put on the earrings. She checked the mirror. She thought, "I am a trauma surgeon. I have put my hands inside human chests and held hearts still long enough to repair them. I can sit across a dinner table from this man for 2 hours." The restaurant on Park Avenue was the kind of place where the lighting was designed to make everyone look like they were in the best moment of their lives. They were seated at the corner table Damien preferred, his back to the wall, clear sightlines. The particular positioning of a man who had, she now understood, been trained by instinct or design to always know what was coming from every direction. He was already there when she arrived. He stood when he saw her, the way he always did, and she walked to him and let him kiss her cheek, and she smelled his cologne and thought, 9 years. "You look beautiful," he said. "Thank you." She sat, picked up the menu. "How was the meeting this morning?" "Long." He settled back into his chair with the ease of a man who had never doubted his safety in a room. "Marcus, you remember Marcus from the Whitfield group. He's bringing in a new Singapore partner. Lots of paperwork." She nodded. She thought, Whitfield. The gathering in 6 weeks. The room where he plans to announce Clara. She said, "When's the Whitfield event?" A fraction of a pause. So small she might have missed it last week. 6 weeks, I think. "Why?" "I thought we should go together this year. We skipped last time." He looked at her over the top of his menu. Something moved in his eyes, just for a moment, something that wasn't quite the warmth he usually performed, and then it was gone. "Sure," he said. "Good idea." She ordered the salmon. She drank half a glass of wine. She asked about his week and listened to him talk and watched his hands and his jaw and the way his eyes moved, and she thought about the folder in his desk and the papers with her name in them and the attorney who had already been paid and the woman who had stood in her apartment weeping at her father's funeral. She thought, "You practiced this for 9 years. So did I. I just didn't know it." After dinner, he suggested a walk. The rain had stopped and the streets were clean and cold, and they walked along Park with his hand in the crook of her elbow, the way they had walked for years. And she matched his pace and said the appropriate things, and performed the appropriate version of herself so precisely that no one watching from the outside would have seen anything except a couple walking in a city at night. Inside, she was taking inventory. She got home before him, so she said she was tired. He said he had a few calls to make from the office, the usual choreography. She went to the bedroom. She sat on the edge of the bed in her dress with the door closed and pulled out her phone and began a search she should have started years ago. She searched Damien Voss, not his business profile, not the curated public record he maintained. She searched beneath that. She searched the names associated with his company, the subsidiary structures she could find in public filings, the connections between his firm and a holding company registered in Delaware that she found on the 3rd page of results, buried under a more visible entity with a similar name. She followed the holding company. It connected to 3 other entities. 2 of those entities connected to names she didn't recognize. The 3rd connected to a name she did, Marcus Whitfield. She sat with that for a moment. Marcus Whitfield was not simply a business associate. She had heard Damien mention him dozens of times over the years. Casually, the way you mention someone who is furniture rather than architecture. But the financial connection between Damien's holding company and Whitfield's primary entity was not casual. The figures in the filings, the ones she could access, were significant. The ones she couldn't access, well, she could feel their outline. She kept searching. She found a sealed court proceeding from 11 years ago, a civil matter, names redacted in the public summary, but the case number visible. She photographed the screen. She found a regulatory inquiry from 8 years ago, a financial conduct matter closed without formal finding, and the name of the firm under review was 1 step removed from Damien's current structure by exactly 1 corporate layer. She thought, "You're not just a man who wants my father's money. You are a man who has been building something for a long time and needed something I have. The respectability of a surgeon's name beside yours. The social access, the clean profile. She thought, I was structural to your architecture and I never knew it. She put the phone face down on the mattress. She sat in the dark and breathed. At 11:47, she heard the front door, his footsteps in the hallway, the particular weight of them, steady, unhurried. He moved through the apartment with the authority of a man who believed everything in it was already his. She heard him pause outside the bedroom door. She closed her eyes, controlled her breathing, slowed it to the rhythm of sleep. He opened the door. She felt the shift in the air. He stood there for a moment. She could feel him looking at her. And then he closed the door softly and moved toward the bathroom. She lay still. She thought about the Whitfield gathering in 6 weeks, the room where he intended to unmake her in front of people who had known them both as a couple. She thought about the attorney's draft papers. She thought about 6 weeks and what could be done inside that window if a person moved carefully and did not waste a single day. She thought, I need more than the documents. I need something that can't be dismissed. The next morning, she texted Theo Park at 7:15. Free today? Afternoon works for me. He replied in 6 minutes. 2 o'clock. Not near the office. She picked a bookstore cafe on the Upper West Side, the kind of place with enough ambient noise that conversations disappeared into the background. He was there before her. He looked worse than he had the day before, less composed, like something had shifted in his internal arrangement overnight. He had coffee already, and his hands were wrapped around the cup the way people hold things when they're trying to keep themselves grounded. She sat. She looked at him and decided not to perform. I know something's wrong, she said. I'm not going to pretend I don't. He looked at her. He said nothing. I also know you're scared. She kept her voice low and even. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm asking you to tell me what you know. Because what I've found on my own is already enough to understand that Damien is not what he has presented himself to be. And if I'm going down for something I didn't do, I'd rather know the full shape of it. His jaw moved. He stared into his coffee. Theo, you don't understand what he is, he said, quietly, almost to the cup. Then help me understand. A long pause. The bookstore made its gentle noise around them. Someone laughed at the counter. Somewhere between the laughter and the quiet, Theo Park made a decision that she could see crossing his face like weather. He's not a businessman, Theo said. The firm is real. The clients are real. But underneath it, he stopped. There are people who move money through his structure, people who need a legitimate architecture to clean what they have. He runs the operation. He's been running it for, I don't know, more than a decade, probably longer. Sienna did not move. She breathed, in through the nose. How many people know? In the firm, 3, maybe 4. They don't know everything. They know enough to be afraid. He looked up at her then. I've been his assistant for 6 years. I know more than any of them. Why are you still there? His face answered that before his mouth did, the specific look of a man who had tried to leave and found the door locked from the outside. He knows things about me, Theo said. Things from before. I made decisions I can't unmake. He stopped. I'm not a good person, Dr. Vale. I want you to know that before you decide to trust anything I tell you. She said, I'm not looking for good people right now. I'm looking for honest ones. Something crossed his face. Not relief exactly, more like the expression of someone who has been carrying a weight so long they've forgotten it's possible to set it down. The Whitfield gathering, she said, but tell me what you know about it. He told her. He talked for 31 minutes. She did not take notes. She stored it in the same part of her mind she used to retain the details of complicated procedures, the part that didn't blur under pressure. She stored Whitfield's name and his function in the network. She stored the names of 2 other men whose organizations moved through Damien's structure and who would be at the gathering. She stored the fact that the event was not merely a social occasion, that it functioned on its secondary level as a meeting point for financial arrangements that required deniability and atmosphere, and the kind of room where everyone present had enough to lose that silence was understood as survival. And she stored the last thing Theo told her, the thing that made the coffee shop feel smaller and the ambient noise feel farther away. There's a woman, Theo said. Clara Whitmore. She's been... I know about Clara. He stopped, looked at her, reassessed whatever he thought he understood about the situation. She brought him something, he said slowly. About 3 weeks ago. Documents, personal. I don't know what was in them. He didn't show me. But he was pleased. He was very pleased, and that's not something I see often. He paused. He told Marcus afterward that the timeline was moving forward, that the last piece was in place. The last piece. Her own words, her private grief copied and handed over like a transaction. She sat for a moment with that. Then she said, I need one thing from you, Theo. Just one. And then I won't ask you for anything else until you're ready. What? The name of someone inside his financial structure who might be looking for a way out. Someone with documentation. He stared at the table. For a long time. Long enough that she thought he was going to say no. Then he said a name she didn't recognize and an organization she would spend the next 4 days learning everything about. And she understood when he said it, from the way his shoulders dropped and his breath changed, that he had just committed to something he couldn't uncommit to, and that the thing she was building had just acquired a second foundation. She left the bookstore at 3:15. She walked 2 blocks before she called Nora. It's worse than I thought, she said. How much worse? Organized? She stopped on the sidewalk. People moved around her in the cold. Nora, he didn't marry me to steal from me. He married me because I was useful to something he was already running. The inheritance was just the next acquisition. A silence on the line. Are you safe right now? Nora asked. I think so. He doesn't know I know. Are you sure? She thought about the dinner last night. His face over the menu when she'd mentioned the Whitfield event. The fraction of a pause that was nothing and everything. She said, I was sure yesterday. She wasn't sure anymore. That was the thing about the past 72 hours. Every layer she removed revealed not an answer but another layer, and the structure underneath was larger than the one above it. And she was beginning to understand that she had been standing on something hollow for 9 years and only now could feel the particular resonance of it beneath her feet. She walked back to the hospital. She changed into scrubs. She stood at the sink in the attending's lounge and ran cold water over her wrists the way she did before a long surgery. Not for any clinical reason anymore, just for the sensation of something cold and real and immediate. She looked at herself in the mirror. She thought, you have 6 weeks. You have a name Theo gave you. You have draft documents in a folder, in a desk, in an apartment that isn't yours. You have 43 seconds of audio that won't hold up in court. You have your medical degree and your reputation, and the thing Damien spent 9 years trying to turn into a liability, but which is actually, if you use it correctly, the sharpest instrument you own. She thought, you have been a surgeon for 15 years. You know how to work with what you have. You know how to be precise. She dried her hands. She straightened up. Her pager went off. A trauma incoming. Motorcycle versus bus. ETA, 4 minutes. She walked out of the lounge and toward the ER bay, and her hands were steady, and her mind was clear, and somewhere in the city Damien Voss was moving through his day in the absolute certainty that he had already won, and he was wrong, and he would not know he was wrong until she was ready for him to know it. That was the plan. That was the only plan. But plans assume that the person you're outmaneuvering isn't also watching. And 3 hours later, when Sienna came out of surgery and picked up her phone, she found a message from a number she didn't recognize that contained 4 words and nothing else. He knows you're looking. 4 words on a screen from a number that didn't exist in any directory she could find. He knows you're looking. Sienna stood in the corridor outside the surgical suite with the antiseptic smell still in her hair and the adrenaline from the last 3 hours still running its slow exit through her system, and she read the message 4 times. She did not call the number back. She did not respond. She took a screenshot, deleted the message from her phone's visible log, and stood very still for a moment while the corridor moved around her. Nurses, a resident pushing a chart cart, someone laughing far away down the hall. She thought about Theo. She thought about the 31 minutes in the bookstore and the name he had given her and the way his shoulders had dropped when he committed to something he couldn't undo. She thought about whether Theo was the one who'd sent the message or whether Theo was the reason someone else had. She called Nora from a landline in an empty consultation room. "I got a message," she said. "Anonymous. It says he knows." A pause. "How long ago?" 20 minutes. "Are you still at the hospital?" "Yes." "Stay there. Don't go home tonight." Nora's voice had shifted into the register she used during genuine emergencies, stripped of everything except function. "Do you have somewhere else?" "I can find somewhere." "Find it now. Don't use a credit card connected to any joint account. Do you have cash?" "Some." "Get more. From a branch, not an ATM near the hospital." A brief silence. "Sienna, if he knows you've been asking questions, the apartment is not safe. Not because of physical danger necessarily, because of what he can do to your things, your documents, your devices." She thought about the journals. She had moved the one from her nightstand into her overnight bag 3 days ago. The others, there were 2 more, older, in a box in the closet behind her winter coats, she had not touched. "There are more journals," she said, "at the apartment. Can you get someone else to get them?" She couldn't send Nora. She couldn't send anyone who could be connected to her. She thought about the shape of the problem. The apartment she couldn't safely return to, the journals she couldn't leave behind. The man who might or might not already know that the architecture he'd built around her was being examined from inside. She said, "I'll handle it." She went back to the apartment at 6:15 in the evening, when Damien would normally still be at the office. She checked his location on the shared map app they'd used for years. It showed him in Midtown, stationary. She did not trust it, but she used it anyway because she had no better instrument. She moved through the apartment fast. Shoes off at the door so her footsteps didn't carry. She went to the bedroom closet, pushed through the winter coats, found the archive box on the shelf above them. She pulled it down. Inside, the 2 older journals, a folder of medical licensing documents, and a small envelope she'd forgotten. The thumb drive her father had given her 2 years before he died. The one he'd said contained personal records she might need someday, and which she'd never opened because opening it meant accepting that he had believed he might not be there when she needed it. She stared at the thumb drive for 3 seconds. She put it in her pocket. She put the journals in her bag. She replaced the box on the shelf. She was in and out of the bedroom in under 4 minutes. She was moving through the hallway toward the front door when she heard the elevator. She stopped. The elevator in this building made a specific sound when it reached their floor, a soft mechanical tone that she'd heard 10,000 times. She'd heard it tonight and understood it the way you understand a sound that means something has changed. She looked at the front door, 8 feet away. She looked back down the hallway. His study was to the left, the kitchen straight ahead, the front door to the right. The elevator tone again. Closer. She moved to the front door, opened it silently, stepped into the corridor. She did not close it behind her. She eased it shut with her hand flat on the surface until the latch caught without sound. She was in the stairwell 2 seconds later and descending before she let herself breathe. In the lobby, she nodded at the doorman and walked out into the evening like a woman who had somewhere to be. She hailed a cab. She got in. She set an address 14 blocks away and watched the building recede through the rear window. Her phone showed Damien's location, still in Midtown. She thought, then who was in the elevator? She spent that night in a hotel on the west side, a mid-range place that took cash and didn't require her to show identification at the desk if she paid for 3 nights up front. She sat on the bed with the thumb drive in her palm for a long time before she found a laptop adapter in the hotel business center downstairs. Her father's drive contained 17 folders. Most were financial, tax records, estate documents, correspondence with attorneys. She moved through them quickly, looking for the shape of something without knowing what shape she was looking for. She found it in the 14th folder. It was a series of emails. Her father to an attorney, not the estate attorney she knew, but a different one. A man named Greer, whose practice she had never heard of. The dates on the emails ran from 4 years before his death to 8 months before it. The last one sent when he was already ill, already losing the particular sharpness that had defined him. She read them in order. Her father had been suspicious of Damien Voss for 3 years before he died. Not of the affair. He hadn't known about Clara. He had been suspicious of the financial structure Damien had proposed for the estate trust, the one Sienna had signed off on because she trusted her husband and was busy and grieving in advance of a loss she could already see coming. Her father had hired Greer to look into it quietly. He had not told Sienna because she read his words and felt them land with a specific weight in her chest. He had not wanted to cause her pain without proof, and he had been running out of time to get proof, and the last email said, "If I don't resolve this before the illness progresses, Sienna will need to know everything. I need you to make sure she finds this drive." He had given her the drive himself, pressed it into her hand at the hospital 8 days before he died, and said, "Keep this somewhere safe, Mia." His old name for her, from her childhood, and she had held it and said, "I will," and put it in the archive box and not touched it for 18 months because she couldn't. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and held it there for a moment. Then she kept reading. Greer's findings, summarized in the final attachment: the trust structure Damien had proposed routed her father's estate assets through a management entity that, on paper, had 2 controllers, Sienna and a secondary fiduciary position that Damien had quietly installed for himself through a proxy company. The proxy company was registered in a state she'd never had reason to think about, its ownership traced back through 2 layers to the same Delaware holding entity she'd found herself 3 nights ago. Damien had been inside her father's estate before her father was cold. Not after, before. The structure had been in place before Marcus Vale died, before the inheritance was even formally transferred. Damien had built himself into the architecture of her father's life's work while the man was still alive and fighting to stay that way, and her father had seen it coming and spent his last months trying to find the evidence to protect her, and had died with the work unfinished, trusting a thumb drive and a daughter who hadn't opened it in time. She sat in the hotel room at 2 in the morning with the laptop on her knees and the rain starting again outside, and she let herself feel it, all of it, the grief and the fury, and the particular cold horror of understanding that the man who had held her hand at her father's funeral had helped engineer the conditions of her vulnerability. She let herself feel it for exactly 4 minutes because that was all she could afford. Then she dried her face, straightened up, looked at the screen. She thought, "You have the drive. You have Greer's findings. You have Theo. You have 6 weeks minus 4 days." She sent an email to Attorney Greer at 3 in the morning, identifying herself, referencing her father's correspondence, and requesting an urgent meeting. She did not use her regular email address. She had created a new account from the hotel's business center using a name that meant nothing and connected to nothing. She fell asleep at 4. She was awake at 6:15. Greer responded at 7:42. "I've been waiting for this contact for 18 months. I'm available today." She met him in his office in a building on the east side that was specifically not the kind of building where Damien's world operated. Smaller, older, the kind of practice that survived on referrals and reputation rather than corporate volume. Greer was 63 and looked like someone who had spent decades being right about things and taking no pleasure in it. He shook her hand and looked at her face and said, "You look like your father." She said, "Tell me what you found." He told her. For an hour and 20 minutes, he laid out what he'd been unable to bring to court while her father was alive. The proxy structure, the financial controls, the evidence of movement through the estate trust that suggested Damien had already begun pulling assets through his network. Not large amounts yet, small ones. The kind that were testing the architecture before the heavier work began. "Why didn't you go to the authorities?" she asked. "With what? Corporate filings and a theory?" "Your father knew the limit of what we had. We needed a direct financial record, something showing the flow explicitly, and we hadn't gotten there." He paused. There was also the question of what Voss would do if he knew he was being examined. Your father was not a well man. The risk calculus was not in his favor. She understood that. She filed it away. "I have something," she said. She told him about Theo, about the name Theo had given her. The person inside Damien's financial structure who might want out. Greer wrote the name down. He looked at it for a moment. He said, "I know who that is. If that person is willing to talk, we have our direct financial record." "Then we need to move fast," she said. "I have reason to believe Damien knows he's being watched. Not specifically, but generally. How long before his timeline forces his hand? 5.5 weeks. There's a gathering at Whitfield's estate. He's planning to use it. Greer nodded slowly. Then we have 4 weeks to build something that doesn't need to be perfect. It needs to be undeniable. She left his office at 10:15. She walked 3 blocks before her phone rang. Damien. She answered. Hey. His voice was the morning voice. Warm, easy, the voice of a man who slept well. I came home last night and you weren't there. I got worried. Late rounds, she said. I told you it might be a long one. I texted. I know, I saw it after. A pause, the particular pause of someone listening for something beneath words. Are you okay? You've seemed a little distant this week. I'm tired. She kept walking, kept her voice in the register of a tired woman. The workload's been intense. You should take some time off. I know. I mean it, Sienna. You run yourself into the ground, and then you don't have anything left. Another pause. Come home tonight. I'll cook. She thought about the elevator sound. She thought about who had been in that elevator. She said, I'll try to be back by 7. Good. His voice softened. I miss you. She ended the call. She stood on the sidewalk with the phone at her side and the city moving around her and the cold settling into the gap between her coat collar and her jaw. She thought about those words, I miss you, and the particular performance of them, the precision of a man who had spent 9 years calibrating the right amount of warmth to produce the right amount of trust. She went back to the hospital. She worked. She did not go home at 7. At 4 in the afternoon, she got a call from a number she recognized as Theo's. She answered it in the stairwell. Something happened, he said. He was speaking quietly, too quietly. Last night, one of the partners called a meeting this morning, unscheduled. I wasn't invited, but I was in the building. What happened in the meeting? I don't know everything, but afterward, Damien came out and he looked... Theo paused. I've worked for him for 6 years. I've seen him in bad situations. He doesn't show things, but he showed something today. And then he called Marcus Whitfield for 40 minutes. And I couldn't hear the content, but I heard the tone. What tone? The kind he uses when he's accelerating something. Her chest went tight. What does accelerating mean? It means he's not waiting 6 weeks anymore. She leaned against the stairwell wall. The concrete was cold against her shoulder through her coat. She thought about Greer's timeline, 4 weeks to build something undeniable, and the way it had just compressed without warning. How much time do you think we have? I don't know. Days? Maybe less. A pause. Dr. Vale, the person I mentioned, the one with documentation. If you're going to make that contact, you need to do it today. Not tomorrow. Today. She said, give me a number. He gave her a number. She called it from a payphone she found 2 blocks from the hospital. One of the last 3 payphones she knew of in this part of the city, a relic she'd noted once and filed away for no reason she could have articulated at the time. The phone rang 6 times. A man answered. She said the name Greer had confirmed. She said Theo's name. She said, I have an attorney. I have a meeting you need to be in. Tell me where you can be at 9 tonight. A silence long enough to hold a decision. Then he gave her an address. She called Greer from the same payphone. She said, tonight, 9 o'clock. She gave him the address. She went back to the hospital. She changed. She told the charge nurse she was leaving for the evening, and she walked out through the main entrance and flagged a cab and gave an address that was nowhere near where she actually needed to be, then redirected twice before she got out 3 blocks from the meeting location. The address was a bar in the 30s. Not dark and atmospheric, just functional, the kind of place with enough volume that nobody listened to adjacent conversations. She arrived at 8:50. Greer was already at a corner table. 3 minutes later, a man she recognized from the corporate filings she'd researched, mid-50s, careful eyes, a posture that communicated years of managed stress, sat down across from them. His name was Carl Demers. He had been a financial controller inside Damien's primary operating structure for 11 years. He had, he told them, been trying to find a safe exit for 3 of those years. He talked. Greer recorded, with Demers's consent, on a device Greer had brought in his coat pocket. Sienna listened and took nothing down and stored everything. Demers described the flow of funds, where they entered the structure, how they moved through the legitimate business architecture, where they exited, and in what form. He described the names of 3 external parties whose money moved through Damien's network. He described the function of the Whitfield gathering not just as a social event but as a settlement occasion, a point at which certain financial arrangements were confirmed and new ones initiated, always in person, always in a room controlled by people with aligned interests in maintaining silence. He described Sienna's father's estate. He described it in specific terms that matched Greer's findings and then exceeded them. The actual movement of funds, the amounts, the dates, the accounts. He described a transaction from 9 months ago, 6 months after Marcus Vale's death, in which a significant sum from the estate trust had been moved through the proxy structure and allocated to an account that Demers described as belonging to a third party whose name Sienna did not recognize. Greer asked Demer if he had documentation. Demers produced from an inner pocket a folded envelope. Inside the envelope was a USB drive. "Copies," Demers said. "The originals are in a location Voss doesn't know about. I've been building this for 2 years." Sienna looked at the drive on the table. She thought about her father's drive, the one pressed into her hand with the last reserve of his strength. She thought about 2 people, separately, spending years assembling the same evidence from different angles. She thought, he made enemies before he made plans to make me one. They were 40 minutes into the meeting when Greer's phone buzzed. He looked at it. His face changed. Not dramatically, just a subtle recalibration that she'd learned to read as a warning sign. He turned the phone to show her. A news alert. A financial publication. One of the smaller, faster ones that ran items before the larger outlets confirmed them. The headline read, "Prominent Manhattan surgeon under investigation for professional misconduct. Sources." The article, which she read in 45 seconds, described an anonymous complaint filed with the state medical board alleging that Dr. Sienna Vale had falsified patient records on at least 2 occasions, had demonstrated erratic behavior during surgical procedures, and had been the subject of internal concern among hospital colleagues. The complaint had been filed that afternoon. The article included a quote from an unnamed source close to the situation. "Those who work with her have expressed concern about her stability and judgment for some time." She set the phone down on the table. She thought about Damien's voice that morning. "You've seemed a little distant this week." She thought about the meeting in his office that Theo had been excluded from. She thought about the 40-minute call to Marcus Whitfield afterward. She thought about the word Theo had used, accelerating. This was not the planned sequence. He had not waited for the divorce filing, for the competency proceeding, for the Whitfield gathering. Something had shifted his timeline, and he had moved immediately to the most direct available weapon, her career, her reputation. The thing she had built across 15 years of 7-day weeks and impossible hours, and every choice that had cost her something personal in exchange for something professional. He had filed a complaint with the medical board. On the same day she had met with his former financial controller. On the same day she had records placed in Greer's possession that connected Damien to a criminal financial structure. She said, "He knows." Greer said yes. Demers said nothing. He was watching her face. She looked at the table. She looked at the USB drive still sitting where Demers had placed it. She looked at her own hands, flat on the surface, steady in the way they had trained themselves to be across 15 years of working on people who were running out of time. She said, "How fast can you verify this material?" Greer said, "With Demers's cooperation, 48 hours for a preliminary assessment, a week for something presentable." "We don't have a week." "I know. If the medical board complaint moves forward, my hospital privileges come under review. If my privileges are under review, I'm removed from active surgical duty. If I'm removed from active duty..." She stopped. She did not finish the sentence because she did not need to. They both understood the structure. Without her position, she lost the one element of her public profile that made her credible against whatever story Damien was now constructing. She became exactly what the complaint alleged, an unstable woman whose husband's concern for her well-being had finally forced a reckoning. She became the narrative he had been building for 2 years. She looked at Greer. "Who do you know at the board?" "One person, a process investigator. She's not corrupt, but she's procedural. She goes where the evidence points. Then we give her evidence. Sienna looked at the drive on the table. At Deemer's. Can you be in front of a camera tomorrow morning? Recorded testimony. Notarized. Demers looked at the drive. He looked at her. He said, I've been waiting 3 years for someone to build a room I could say this in. I'm building the room, she said. I need you in it tomorrow. He said yes. She left the bar at 10:40. She walked 4 blocks before she let herself stop moving, standing in the doorway of a closed dry cleaner with the city noise around her, and the cold coming up from the pavement, and the taste of something metallic at the back of her throat that she recognized as the specific flavor of fear that arrived not during the crisis but immediately after, when the body finally understood what the mind had already processed. Her phone buzzed. A text from Clara. Hey, are you okay? I saw something online. Call me if you need to talk. I'm here for you. Sienna read it, the tenderness of it, the practiced warmth, the exactly right phrasing, the deployment of I'm here for you, a phrase Clara had said to her 100 times across the years, a phrase that had meant something once and now meant the opposite of everything. She thought about Clara sitting across from her at her father's funeral, holding her hand, eyes wet. She typed back 3 words. I'm fine. Thanks. She looked at her own response for a moment. Then she put the phone in her pocket and started walking again. She had 4 blocks to the subway and a hotel room at the end of it, and a meeting with Greer at 7 in the morning, and Demers' testimony beginning at 8, and a medical board inquiry opening against her name that she had approximately 48 hours to counter before it calcified into something she couldn't dismantle. She walked. She thought, you moved early because you're afraid. You're afraid because you found out I was looking. You're afraid because somewhere in your structure there's a crack you didn't put there, and you can feel it. She thought, good. She descended into the subway. The platform was cold and loud and entirely indifferent to what was happening to her life. A train arrived in 90 seconds. She got on. She stood holding the overhead bar with both hands and watched the dark tunnel move past the windows, and thought about everything she had, and everything she'd lost, and the specific distance between those 2 things. She thought about her father pressing the drive into her hand. Keep this somewhere safe, Mia. She had kept it safe for 18 months without knowing what was in it. She thought, I'm sorry it took me this long. The train moved. The lights in the car flickered once, a brief, total dark. And in that second of darkness, Sienna Vale stood in a subway car in the city she had lived in for 15 years and understood, with a completeness she had not felt before, that the person she had been before 4 days ago was gone. That woman had trusted the wrong people and paid for it with years she couldn't recover. That woman was done. What was left was not harder exactly. It was more accurate. It was the version of herself that had always existed beneath the trust and the marriage and the careful management of other people's feelings. The version that had stood in operating theaters when the outcome was uncertain and the patient was failing and every instinct said panic and had chosen precision instead. The train came out of the tunnel into the elevated section above the street, and for a moment the lights of the city spread out below her, enormous and indifferent, and somewhere in it Damien Voss was in his apartment or his office or his bed, believing he had already won, believing the medical board complaint would collapse her, believing the story he was constructing was the only story available. He was wrong. But she would need to prove it in less than 48 hours, with a drive full of documents and a frightened man's testimony, and an attorney with one contact at the medical board, before the structure he had spent a decade building came down on her completely and buried everything she had left. And what she didn't know yet, what she couldn't have known standing on that train in the flickering light, was that by morning, one of the 3 people she was counting on would be gone. She found out at 6:47 in the morning when Greer called her instead of texting, which meant it was bad. Demer, he said. He's not coming. She was already dressed, sitting on the edge of the hotel bed with her shoes on and her coat across her lap. What happened? He called me an hour ago, said he changed his mind, said he needed more time. A pause. He sounded afraid, Sienna. Not uncertain. Afraid. Someone got to him overnight. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. The drive? He kept it. He wouldn't confirm whether he still had it or whether... Greer stopped. I don't know what happened between 10 last night and 5 this morning, but he's out. She stood up. She walked to the window. The city below was gray and early and entirely unconcerned. Can you still go to your contact at the board? With what I have from your father's files, yes. But without Deemer's testimony, the financial documentation is circumstantial. It supports the picture. It doesn't prove the transaction. How long does the board need before they act on the complaint against me? Formal review opens in 72 hours from the filing. Once it opens, your privileges come under automatic suspension pending outcome. 72 hours from yesterday afternoon, which meant she had until sometime tomorrow evening before the structure Damien had built around her name closed completely. She thought about Demer's face in the bar last night, the specific look of a man who had made a decision and felt the weight of it leave his body. That look had been real. Whatever had reversed it between then and now had not come from inside him. She said, "Someone warned him. Damien's people found out about the meeting." That's my read. She thought about the anonymous text. He knows you're looking. She thought about how many points of exposure she had accumulated in 4 days. Theo, Demers, Greer, the payphone calls, the hotel. She had been careful. She had not been careful enough. "Okay," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not quite, but her voice was. "We go to the board with what we have. We go today, not tomorrow. We don't wait for Demer. It may not be enough. It's what we have." She picked up her coat. "And Greer, find Theo. Make sure he's safe. If they got to Demer's, Theo is next." She hung up. She stood in the hotel room in her coat with the city outside and the timeline collapsing around her and everything she had worked for in the last 4 days balanced on documents and a dead man's drive and an attorney with one contact and no guaranteed outcome. She thought, it's not enough. Not yet. Then she thought about the one move she hadn't made, the one she'd been avoiding because it would cost her something she wasn't sure she could afford to lose. She picked up her phone. She dialed Clara Whitmore. It rang twice. "Sienna?" Clara answered, warm and careful. "I've been worried about you." "I know," Sienna said. "We need to talk. In person. Now." A silence. "Okay," Clara said. "Where? Share." Clara suggested a cafe in the West Village. Sienna said no. She said the park, the small one on Hudson, the one with the benches facing the river, because she needed open sightlines and no ambient recording equipment and the kind of space where a person couldn't be cornered. Clara arrived 7 minutes after Sienna. She was wearing a cream coat that Sienna had always liked, her dark hair pulled back, her face arranged in the expression of a concerned friend, open, slightly worried, the performance of someone who had no idea what was coming. She sat on the bench beside Sienna and looked at her face and said, "You look terrible." "I know." "The thing online." "Stop!" Sienna turned to look at her directly, not the way she'd been looking at her for the past week, sideways, measuring, cataloging, directly, the way you look at someone when the performance is finished. "I know about you and Damien." The cold off the river moved between them. Claire's face went through something fast and uncontrolled. Not guilt exactly, more like the expression of someone who has miscalculated the distance to the ground. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Then the architecture came back up. "Sienna." 2 years, Sienna said. "That's what you told him. You've been patient for 2 years. She watched Clara's face. "I heard the call. I heard both of you." A long silence. A jogger passed on the path behind them. The river sat gray and indifferent beyond the railing. Clara exhaled. It was a controlled exhale, the kind that precedes a recalibration rather than a confession. "How long have you known?" 4 days? Something moved in Clara's eyes. Recalculation. "Then why?" "Because I need something from you." Sienna kept her voice flat and cold and stripped of everything except the fact of what she was saying. "And because you are the only person left who can give it to me in the time I have." Clara looked at her. The concerned friend mask was entirely gone now. What was underneath it was harder to read. Not malicious, not triumphant, just the face of a person who had been living 2 lives for long enough that neither one felt entirely real anymore. "What could I possibly have that you need?" "You copied my journals. You gave them to Damien, But before you gave them to him, Sienna paused. You read them. Clara said nothing. All 3 years of them, every entry. Sienna looked at the river. Which means you know what's in them better than he does. He saw them as evidence. You saw them as... She stopped. What did you see them as, Clara? The silence lasted long enough that a second jogger passed and a child somewhere called out to someone, and the city made its ordinary sounds around them. I saw them as you, Clara said, quietly, something in her voice that wasn't performance. Then you know they're not evidence of instability. You know their grief. You know the difference. Sienna turned back to her. Damien is filing a medical board complaint with your copied entries as supporting material. If that complaint stands, I lose my career, not just my marriage, my career. 15 years. Clara looked at her hands. You didn't sign up for that, Sienna said. You signed up for a man. You didn't sign up to destroy the person you spent 12 years being friends with. You don't know what I signed up for. Then tell me. Another silence. Clara pressed her lips together. Something was happening behind her face. Something genuine and uncomfortable and not fully controlled. He told me it would be clean. Divorce, settlement, done. He said you'd be fine, that you had your career, your own money. He's been inside my father's estate for 2 years, Clara. He built himself into the financial structure before my father died. He's been stealing from a dead man's legacy and using me as the legal cover for it. Sienna watched her. Did you know that? From the look on Clara's face, the specific quality of the shock, the way it sat differently from the other things she'd concealed, she hadn't known that, not that part. He told you it was about the inheritance, Sienna said. He told you it was about the divorce. He didn't tell you about the network underneath it, the money that moves through his structure, the names attached to it. She paused. Whitfield's name. Clara went very still. You know that name, Sienna said. Not a question. Clara looked at the river. Her jaw was tight. He mentioned him as a business associate. Marcus Whitfield is not a business associate. He's a financial partner in something that will eventually collapse under federal weight, and when it does, everyone proximate to Damien Voss will be examined, including the woman he's planning to replace his wife with. Sienna leaned forward slightly. You are not his future, Clara. You are his next liability. The words landed. She watched them land, watched Clara's face do something that was not quite grief and not quite fear but occupied the territory between them. What do you want from me? Clara said. Her voice had changed. The warmth was gone. What was left was stripped down and direct, and it was, bizarrely, painfully, the voice Sienna recognized as the real one. The voice Clara used when they were 29 and exhausted and honest with each other in the way that only people who have survived something together can be. The journals, Sienna said, the copies you made. I need you to certify in writing that you provided them to Damien without my knowledge and under his direction. I need the date, the method, and the explicit statement that they were intended for use in a legal proceeding against me. That's a confession. It's a statement. With an attorney present, it's also your best protection when this unravels. Clara stared at her. You're asking me to testify against him. I'm asking you to stop being a weapon he's pointing at me. Sienna held her gaze. You have until tonight. After tonight, I don't have the time to protect you from what comes next, and I will not spend what time I have trying. She stood up. She buttoned her coat against the river cold. She looked at Clara one last time, at the cream coat and the careful hair and the face that had sat across from her at 100 meals and hospital waiting rooms and late nights when they were both young and tired and believed they were building something durable. She said, You were my closest friend for 12 years. I don't know how much of that was real, but if any of it was, this is the moment that matters. She walked away. She did not look back. Her phone rang before she reached the park exit. Greer. We have a problem, he said. She kept walking. What? The board contact. She called me 20 minutes ago. The complaint against you has been upgraded, yeah. It's no longer anonymous. Someone put a name to it. A colleague at the hospital, a Dr. Ruiz. He's filed a supporting statement. She stopped. Ruiz. She knew the name. Rafael Ruiz, a cardiothoracic attending who had been quietly hostile to her for 3 years over a departmental resource dispute that had gone her way and not his. Not a friend of Damien's, she was certain of that, but a man who had a grievance and had been approached at the right moment and given an opportunity to use it. Damien found him, she said. That's my read. With a name-supporting witness, the complaint carries significantly more weight. The board will move faster. How fast? Review convenes tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. If we're not in front of them before that with counter-evidence, the suspension becomes automatic. She looked at her watch. It was 8:22 in the morning. She had under 25 hours. She said, "Get everything from my father's drive formatted for presentation. Everything Greer and your contact can receive and process today. I'm going to the hospital." She was moving again before she finished the sentence. At the hospital, she went directly to the chief of surgery's office. A man named Dr. Owen Marsh, 60 years old, who had hired her out of her fellowship and had the specific loyalty of someone who had watched her work under pressure for 15 years and drawn his own conclusions. His assistant tried to stop her at the door. She walked past the assistant and knocked twice and opened the door. Marsh looked up from his desk. He read her face in approximately 2 seconds. "Close the door," he said. She closed it. She sat across from him. She said, "I need you to hear something before you hear it from anyone else." She told him. Not everything. She didn't tell him about Damien's financial network. Not yet. Not without the documentation fully assembled. But she told him about the complaint, about Ruiz's supporting statement, about the journal entries being used as evidence of instability. She told him in the clear, direct language of a clinician presenting a case, without self-pity and without performance. Marsh listened the way he always listened, entirely still, his hands flat on the desk, his face neutral in the specific way of someone taking information seriously. When she finished, he said, "Ruiz came to me yesterday afternoon." She looked at him. "He said he had concerns about your behavior, that you'd seemed erratic lately, distracted during procedures. I told him I'd look into it." Marsh held her gaze. "I've been watching you work for 15 years, Sienna. I have never seen you erratic in a surgical context, not once." "He was approached," she said. "Someone with a grievance against me was given an avenue to use it." "I believe you." He said it simply. "What do you need from me?" "A character statement for the board. Specific, clinical, citing cases and dates. Something that establishes a record that can't be dismissed as personal loyalty." "I'll have it within 2 hours." He paused. "Is there more to this than what you've told me?" "Yes." "Will it come out?" "Within the week, yes." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "Go do what you need to do. I'll handle Ruiz." She left his office at 9:15. She had her phone in her hand and was composing a message to Greer when she turned the corner toward the attending's lounge and walked directly into Damien. He was standing in his corridor outside the lounge with a visitor badge on his lapel and a paper coffee cup in one hand, and when he saw her, his face arranged itself into the expression she had spent 9 years believing was love. "Hey," he said. "I came to check on you. I was worried." She stopped 4 feet from him. The corridor was not empty. 2 nurses at the station 10 feet away, a resident moving past with a chart. Public. Controlled. She understood in the split second of recalibration that he had come here because it was public. Because a public location meant she couldn't confront him without performing the instability the complaint alleged. She understood that this was also a message. "I can reach you anywhere." She looked at him, at his face, at the coffee cup and the visitor badge, and the easy posture of a man who believed he was still managing a situation. She said, "That's kind of you. Are you okay? The stuff online, I'm handling it." She kept her voice even, kept her face in the register of a tired woman who trusted her husband. "You didn't need to come all the way here." "I wanted to." He stepped forward. He put his free hand on her arm, Xian, the gesture of a solicitous husband, warm and appropriate and entirely calculated. "Come home tonight, please. I don't like you staying at the hotel." She looked at his hand on her arm. She thought about the folder in his desk. She thought about her father's drive. She thought about Demer, frightened into silence overnight, and Theo, who she still hadn't been able to reach this morning. She thought about the Whitfield gathering, which was no longer 6 weeks away, which, if Theo's read was right, was now a matter of days. She said, "I'll come home tonight." His hand relaxed on her arm. She felt the small release of tension in it, the physical register of a man receiving confirmation of something he needed. "Good," he said. "I'll cook." She smiled. She had learned in the past 4 days what her smile was worth as a tool. She deployed it now with the precision of someone who understood exactly what it was buying. He left. She watched him walk back down the corridor toward the elevator, unhurried, the visitor badge catching the light. She turned and went into the attending's lounge and sat down and put her hands on her knees and breathed for 60 seconds without moving. Then she called Nora. "He came to the hospital," she said. "I know, I saw him in the lobby." Nora's voice was tight. "Are you okay?" "I told him I'd come home tonight." A pause. "Sienna, I need to be in that apartment. There's something in his study. The original legal filings, not the drafts, the ones he's had prepared for execution. Greer needs the execution copies, not the drafts. The dates on the execution copies establish the timeline for the estate fraud." She paused. "I need 2 hours in that apartment without him there." "That is not a safe plan." "It's the plan I have." She heard Nora's breathing on the line. "Can you call him? Tonight, around 8? Something plausible. A dinner, a professional thing, something that would take him out for an hour." "You want me to create a cover?" "I want you to give me 60 minutes, that's all." A silence that lasted long enough to contain an entire argument that Nora decided not to have. "I'll call him at 7:30, Nora said. "I'll tell him the department head wants to discuss the research fellowship, something that requires his presence as a donor. He's given to the hospital. He won't refuse." "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just be out of that apartment by 9. She spent the rest of the day in motion. She met with Greer at noon and reviewed the assembled documentation, her father's files, the formatted financial analysis, Marcia's character statement, which arrived by email at 11:50. It was thorough and specific and written with the restrained authority of a man who had no interest in being dismissed. She read it once and felt something she hadn't felt in 4 days, the specific warmth of being seen accurately by someone who had no reason to lie about what they saw. At 3 in the afternoon, Theo Park finally answered her call. He was alive. He was not in the city. He had driven to his sister's house in New Jersey the previous evening after someone had followed him from Damien's office building to his apartment, and he had packed a bag and left and not stopped moving until he crossed the bridge. "I'm sorry," he said, "about Demers. I think they found out through me. There's a woman in the firm who monitors my communications. I didn't know until last night. Are you safe where you are? For now. Stay there. Don't come back until I tell you it's clear." She paused. "Theo, the name you gave me. The person inside the Whitfield network, not Demers. Is there anyone else? Anyone at all?" A long pause. "There's one person," Theo said, "but she's not going to talk to an attorney." "Who would she talk to?" "You," he said. "She'd talk to you. She knew your father. He helped her once, a long time ago, with something she's never forgotten." A pause. "Her name is Ruth Calloway. She runs the event coordination for Whitfield's estate." Sienna wrote the name in her memory. "She has access to the gathering." "She has access to everything," Theo said. "Guest lists, security arrangements, the private room where the financial meetings happen. She's been inside that world for 20 years, and she has a copy of every event record going back 15. Sienna thought about the gathering, about the room Theo had described, the private one where arrangements were made and names were said aloud that were never written down. She thought about what a record of those events would contain. She said, "Get me your number." He sent it in a text 2 minutes later. She called Ruth Calloway at 4:15 from a payphone. The line rang 8 times. She was about to hang up when it connected. No greeting, just silence. Sienna said her name. She said her father's name. She said, "I think you knew him." A pause. Then a woman's voice, older, measured. "Marcus Vale's daughter." "Yes. I heard he passed. 18 months ago." Another pause. "What do you need?" "The gathering at Whitfield's estate. I need to know the date." A silence. "It's been moved," Ruth Calloway said. "It was moved this morning. It's no longer in 5 weeks." Sienna's hand tightened on the receiver. "When?" "4 days." The payphone booth felt very small. Outside it, the city moved in its ordinary way. Cabs and pedestrians and the low machine hum of a place that did not stop for anything, including the specific moment when a person understood that every timeline they had been working against had just collapsed into something they could no longer outrun. "I need to be in that room," Sienna said, "when the meeting happens." Ruth Calloway was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Your father once told me that the only thing worth protecting was what a person built honestly." A pause. "Come to the service entrance at 7 p.m., the night of the event. I'll leave your name with the staff coordinator as a medical consultant. Whitfield has a standing physician on call for his private events." "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just be ready." The woman's voice was flat and certain in the way of someone who had been waiting for a particular moment for a very long time. "These men have been in that room for 20 years. Whatever you bring in with you, make sure it's enough." The line went dead. Sienna replaced the receiver. She stood in the booth for a moment with her hand still on the phone and the city outside and 4 days between her and the room where Damien Voss intended to finish what he started. 4 days. She thought about everything she had: Greer's documentation, Marcia's statement, her father's drive, Ruth Calloway's access, and somewhere in Clara Whitmore's conscience, the weight of 12 years of genuine friendship pressing against 2 years of calculated betrayal. She thought about everything she didn't have: Demers' testimony, enough time, any certainty about which way Clara would fall. She walked out of the booth. She flagged a cab. She gave the driver the address of the penthouse on the 53rd floor and sat in the back seat while the city moved past the windows and her hands rested in her lap, still and certain. And in 4 hours, Nora would call Damien and Damien would leave, and she would have 60 minutes inside the apartment that was not hers to find what she needed, and whatever happened after that would happen in a room full of dangerous people, with a woman she used to call her best friend somewhere in the building, and a man she used to call her husband standing at the center of it all, believing he had already won. She thought, "You've had 9 years. I've had 4 days. And I am not done." The cab pulled up to the building. She got out. The doorman held the door. She walked through the lobby she had walked through 10,000 times before and pressed the button for the 53rd floor and rode up in silence and stepped into the corridor and stood outside the apartment door with her key in her hand. She was reaching for the lock when she heard the sound from inside. Not Damien. Damien was still in Midtown. She had checked the map app in the cab, stationary, had been for 2 hours. Not him. She pressed her ear close to the door. Footsteps. Measured. Moving through the apartment with the specific unhurried quality of someone who knew they were alone. She stepped back from the door. She stood in the corridor with her key in her hand and her heart doing something loud and functional in her chest, and her mind running the options in the 2 seconds she had before she had to choose one. She reached for her phone, called Nora. 1 ring. "Someone's in the apartment," she said, barely above a whisper. "It's not Damien." "Get away from the door," Nora said immediately. "Right now. Go down the stairs, not the elevator. The documents are not worth whatever is on the other side of that door. Move." She moved. She was in the stairwell before Nora finished the sentence, descending, her footsteps controlled even as her breathing wasn't, holding the rail on the turns, counting floors by instinct. She came out in the service corridor on the ground level and moved through it to the side exit and stepped out into the alley beside the building and stood against the wall with the cold against her back and the sound of the city above the alley and her breath coming in visible clouds in the evening air. Her phone buzzed. A message from a number she'd seen once before. The anonymous number. The one that had sent her 4 words 3 days ago. This time it sent 6. He moved the documents. "They're already gone." She stared at the screen. She thought, "Then he knows about Greer. He knows I've been building a case." She thought, "He's not waiting for the gathering. He's moving now." She looked up at the building above her. 53 floors of glass and steel and the life she had lived inside it. And somewhere above her a person she didn't know was in the apartment she didn't own. And the documents she needed were gone. and she had 4 days and no physical evidence and a medical board review opening in the morning and a room she hadn't gotten into yet and a woman whose answer she still didn't have. She thought about what Greer had said. It needs to be undeniable. She thought about what she had left. She thought about the one thing Damien had never considered, the one instrument he had studied for 9 years and cataloged and mapped, and believed he understood completely. The one thing he had spent 2 years trying to turn into a liability, and which was, in the end, the only thing she had that he could not touch, could not copy, could not file a complaint against, could not move in the night while she wasn't watching. She pushed off the wall. She walked out of the alley into the street. She squared her shoulders against the cold and the dark and the specific weight of everything she was carrying, and she began to move toward the last play she had, the one that required her to walk directly into the center of everything Damien had built and do the one thing he had never once prepared for her to do. Tell the truth. Not to Greer, not to the board, not through documents or testimony or carefully formatted evidence packages. In the room, to the people in it, in front of every man who had spent 20 years believing that silence was the only language available to someone who had something to lose. 4 days. She walked. Behind her, on the 53rd floor, a light went off in the penthouse window. And somewhere across the city, in a boardroom or a car or a room she'd never been inside, Damien Voss picked up a phone and made a call that would determine whether his plan survived the next 96 hours or became the last mistake he ever made. And he did not know, could not know, that the woman he had spent 9 years believing he understood completely was no longer the woman he had studied. And the gap between who he thought she was and who she had become in 4 days was exactly wide enough for everything he'd built to fall through. The call lasted 4 minutes. She knew this because she was standing on the corner of the street below the building when it happened. She didn't hear it, couldn't hear it, but she felt the shift in the city's atmosphere the way you feel a pressure change before a storm, the specific quality of air that means something large is about to move. She walked to Greer's office. She didn't call ahead. She arrived at 7:50 and buzzed until he answered and came up in the elevator and stood in his doorway with her coat still on and said, "He moved the documents. He knows about the case." Greer looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped aside to let her in. "How much does he know?" he asked. "Enough to move physical evidence overnight. Enough to send someone into the apartment before I got there." She sat down. She was exhausted in the deep structural way, the kind that lives below muscle and settles into the connective tissue. "The board review opens tomorrow morning. We go in with what we have. Without the execution copies, with Marcia's statement, with my father's files, with the proxy structure analysis." She looked at him. "And with me? I testify. I sit in front of whoever is in that room, and I tell them exactly what I heard on that call, exactly what I found in that desk, and I let them decide what a trauma surgeon with a 15-year record and a clean file looks like against an anonymous complaint supported by a man with a documented grievance." Greer was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant risk." "Everything left is a significant risk." She held his gaze. "Prepare the submission tonight. I'll be at the board at 8:30. He nodded. Once. The nod of a man who had been waiting 18 months for someone to decide to fight. She left his office at 8:15. She stood on the street and called Clara. It rang 3 times. "I've been thinking," Claire said before Sienna could speak. "So have I." A silence. Long enough to hold 12 years. "I'll give you the statement," Claire said. Her voice was flat and stripped and entirely real. "I'll be at Greer's office at 7 tomorrow morning." Sienna closed her eyes for 1 second. 1 second only. "Thank you," she said. She didn't wait for a response. She ended the call. She put the phone in her pocket and looked up at the city above her, the lights of it, the scale of it, the absolute indifference of it to any single person's survival. And she breathed. 3 days until the gathering. Tomorrow, the board. Tonight, nothing except the cold and the city and the specific knowledge that she had exactly enough to walk into the final room and do what she had been trained her entire life to do, stand over something broken and decide with steady hands what could still be saved. The medical board convened at 9 in the morning in a room on the 14th floor of a building on Lexington Avenue that smelled of recycled air and old carpet and the particular institutional neutrality of places where decisions are made about other people's lives. There were 5 members at the table, a court recorder in the corner, Greer beside her, Clara Whitmore in the chair to Sienna's left, in a gray dress with no jewelry, looking like someone who had not slept and had stopped pretending that was not the case. The complaint was read aloud. The supporting statement from Rafael Ruiz was entered into the record. The board chair, a woman in her 60s named Dr. Patricia Ellison, who had the specific economy of movement of someone who had been doing this for 30 years and wasted nothing, looked at the assembled materials over the top of her glasses and then looked at Sienna. Dr. Vale, you've requested the opportunity to respond directly. I have. You may proceed. Sienna spoke for 22 minutes. She did not use notes. She had the information inside her the way she had complex surgical anatomy inside her. Not memorized as a list, but understood as a structure. The way things connected and depended on each other and failed in predictable sequences when pressure was applied incorrectly. She described the call she had overheard. She described the folder in the desk. She described what her father's drive contained and what Greer's analysis of it had produced. She described the proxy structure, the estate trust manipulation, the timeline that placed Damien inside her father's financial architecture before Marcus Vale was dead. She described Clara's role. She said it without looking at Clara. She said it the way she presented difficult findings to a patient's family, clearly, without cruelty, without the softening that would have made it easier to hear but harder to act on. When she finished, Greer submitted the documentation package. Clara's written statement was the last item. 4 pages, notarized at 6:50 that morning, describing in specific detail the request Damien had made, the method by which she had accessed the journals, the date of transfer, and the explicit instruction that the material was intended for use in a legal and reputational proceeding against Dr. Sienna Vale. Clara had written the last paragraph herself, without Greer's prompting. It read, in part, I understood at the time that my actions would cause direct harm to a person I had known for 12 years. I provided the material regardless. I am providing this statement because the harm I participated in was greater than I was told it would be, and because the person I was asked to help destroy does not deserve to be destroyed. Greer had shown Sienna the paragraph at 7:15 that morning. She had read it twice and handed it back without comment. Dr. Ellison reviewed the submission for 11 minutes in silence. The room was very quiet. Sienna sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight and her eyes on the middle distance and breathed the way she breathed when she was waiting for an outcome she had done everything available to her to influence and which was now outside her control. Ellison looked up. The complaint filed against Dr. Vale will be suspended pending a formal investigation into the conduct described in this submission. Dr. Vale's privileges remain fully intact. She looked at Sienna over her glasses. We will be in contact with your attorney regarding the investigation timeline. She looked then at Clara. Ms. Whitmore, you understand that this statement carries its own legal implications. Yes, Clara said. Her voice was steady. I understand. Sienna walked out of the building at 10:40 into the cold November morning with Greer beside her and Clara 3 steps behind. On the sidewalk they stopped. Greer said he would be in contact within the hour and moved toward a cab. Sienna stood on the pavement and the city moved around her and she turned to look at Clara. Clara looked back at her. She looked smaller than she had in the park 2 days ago. Not diminished, reduced to something more accurate. The cream coat was gone. The careful hair was gone. What was left was a woman in a gray dress in the cold who had burned the structure of her own life down in 4 pages of notarized prose and was standing in the aftermath trying to understand what the air felt like now. He'll know by this afternoon, Clara said. Yes. He'll... She stopped. She looked at the pavement. I don't know what he'll do. Greer has people who do. Sienna paused. You should talk to an attorney today. Your own, not his. Clara nodded. She looked up. Something crossed her face. Not a request for forgiveness, nothing as simple as that, but something adjacent to it. The look of a person standing at the edge of an accounting they know they can't escape and have decided to stop trying to. I'm sorry, she said. Just those two words. No architecture around them. Sienna looked at her for a long moment. She thought about 12 years. She thought about her father's funeral and the hand that had held hers in the cemetery. She thought about the specific damage of being betrayed by someone who knew exactly where you were soft. She said, I know. She walked away. She had 2 days until the gathering. She spent them in motion. She met with Greer twice a day. She worked her shifts at the hospital because stopping would have meant something, and she refused to mean it. She ate food she didn't taste in the hotel room at night, and slept in 4-hour intervals and woke at 3 in the morning with the particular alertness of someone whose body had decided that rest was a problem to solve later. Nora came to the hotel on the second evening. She brought food from the Thai place Sienna had loved since residency and sat on the end of the bed, and they ate in companionable silence for a while. And then Nora said, Are you ready for tomorrow? No, Sienna said. I'm going anyway. Nora looked at her. That's usually when you do your best work. Sienna almost smiled. Almost. The evening of the gathering, she dressed in the hotel room with the same focused economy she used before a long surgery. Dark dress. The earrings she had not worn since the night she'd performed for Damien at dinner. She put them on now and looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and thought, not for him, not anymore. For the room. For the people in it. She arrived at the Whitfield estate in Greenwich at 6:45. It was a property that expressed its money through restraint, large without being ostentatious, the grounds lit with the specific understatement of someone who had nothing to prove to anyone who mattered. Cars lined the circular drive. Caterers moved through the side entrance with the choreographed efficiency of people who had done this many times. At the service entrance, a woman in her late 50s was waiting. Ruth Calloway was compact and precise, with the unhurried demeanor of someone who had spent 20 years in rooms like this one and had long since stopped being impressed by them. She looked at Sienna for a moment, taking in the dress and the earrings and the specific quality of stillness that Sienna carried. You look like your father when he'd made up his mind about something, Ruth said. He was more patient than I am. He was patient because he had time. Ruth handed her a lanyard, a staff credential, medical consultant, the name a variant of her own that would pass a cursory check. You have 1 hour before the private meeting begins. The room is the study on the east wing, second floor. Whitfield uses it for the settlement conversations. It's not on the event floor. What's the access situation? Staff corridor connects to it from the back. I'll prop the door at 7:45. She paused. There are 4 men who use that room. Whitfield, your husband, 2 others whose names you'll recognize from what you've assembled. She looked at Sienna directly. What you doing there? I can't control it, but I can tell you that whatever you bring, you need to be the one holding it when the room turns. I'll be holding it. Ruth held her gaze for another moment. Then she nodded once and moved away into the service corridor and was gone. Sienna went inside. The gathering was the kind of event that existed in the narrow register between business and social, where everyone present understood that the conversation on the surface was not the conversation that mattered. She moved through it with a glass of wine she didn't drink, nodding at faces she half recognized from years of being Damien's wife at these kinds of functions. She was dressed right. She was positioned right. She was, to everyone in the room, exactly what she appeared to be, a woman who belonged here. She saw Damien at 7:08. He was across the room near the windows, in a dark suit, speaking to Marcus Whitfield with the ease of a man on his own terrain. He hadn't seen her yet. She watched him for a moment, the profile, the controlled posture, the particular way he held himself in rooms full of people who owed him things, or feared him, or both. She had watched him in rooms like this for 9 years, and believed she was seeing a husband. Now she saw the architecture beneath it, and it was not smaller than she'd imagined. It was larger. It was the frame the whole performance had been hung on. He turned. He saw her. The stillness that crossed his face lasted less than a second, then it was gone, replaced by the expression she had cataloged and filed and was done being deceived by, the warmth, the easy pleasure, the face of a man who was glad she was here. He crossed the room. Sienna. He kissed her cheek. She let him. I didn't know you were coming. Last-minute decision. She held his gaze. I thought I should be here. Something moved in his eyes. The calculation was fast and practiced, but she could see it now, the way you can see the machinery of something once you know where to look. He was reading her, her dress, her posture, the earrings, the wine glass she hadn't touched. He was trying to determine what version of her this was. He said, "I'm glad you're here." She said, "I know you are." She moved away before he could respond. She circulated for 40 minutes, doing nothing that would break the surface of the evening. And at 7:43, she found the staff corridor at the back of the east wing and moved through it to the study door that was, as Ruth had said it would be, propped open exactly 1 inch. She went in. She closed the door behind her. She stood in the room for a moment, getting its measure. A proper study, books on the walls that had been read, a fireplace, a round table at the center with 6 chairs around it. On a credenza against the far wall, a laptop, closed. Beside the laptop, a leather portfolio she recognized as the style Whitfield used for formal arrangements. She crossed to the credenza. She opened the portfolio. Inside were the settlement documents, not drafts. Executed originals signed and dated within the past 48 hours. She photographed every page with the precise speed of someone who had done this before, in a different apartment, in a different emergency, 4 days ago and a lifetime ago. The financial arrangements described in the documents exceeded everything Greer had estimated. The structure was not just an estate fraud, it was the record of a 20-year arrangement between 4 men who had built their collective security on the certainty that no one on the outside would ever find the room. She finished photographing. She replaced the portfolio exactly. She stepped back from the credenza. The door opened. Damien stood in the doorway. He looked at her. He looked at the credenza. He looked at her phone, which she was still holding. The calculation in his face was gone. What replaced it was something she had not seen there before in 9 years. Something stripped of performance, the actual face of a man who has run the numbers and found them not in his favor. He closed the door behind him. The room was very quiet. "How long?" he said. Not a question. The version of the sentence that means, "Tell me the shape of the damage." 4 days, she said. He looked at her. "The call." "Yes. I checked the Mirror app. I disconnected it 2 years ago." "You disconnected it from your phone. You didn't disconnect it from the tablet." She held his gaze. "That was the problem with you, actually. You were thorough about everything you thought mattered, and careless about everything you decided didn't." He stood with his back against the door and his hands at his sides and looked at her the way people look at something they have badly miscalculated. She had expected anger. There was some of that. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the particular tension of a man who has spent his life controlling rooms and is standing in one he doesn't control. But beneath the anger was something else. Something she had not expected and did not know what to do with. A species of recognition. The look of someone seeing a person clearly for the first time and understanding, too late, that the underestimation was the error that ended everything. He said, "What have you done?" "I've given everything I have to an attorney who filed it with 3 agencies simultaneously at 7 this evening." She paused. "The financial records from Demers's drive, the proxy structure analysis, the estate trust documentation, the executed settlement portfolio you just watched me photograph." She let that sit for a moment. "And Clara's statement about the journals, about the sequence." She paused again. "Greer gave copies to a financial crimes investigator 2 hours ago. The investigator had already been building a file on Whitfield's network for 14 months. What we gave them completed it." Something moved through his face that she had no name for. "You had 4 days," he said. "You had 9 years," she said, "and you spent them studying the wrong things about me." He looked at her for a long moment. The fireplace made its small sound. Somewhere on the other side of the wall, the gathering continued its performance of normalcy. And in this room, 2 people stood in the wreckage of a marriage that had never been what one of them believed it was. And the air between them held 9 years of chosen blindness and 4 days of brutal clarity. He said, "The business, the network. You understand what happens to, Yes," she said, "I understand what happens. People will—" "I know." She didn't let him finish, not because she was cruel, but because she had already thought through every consequence he was about to enumerate and had made her peace with each one in the 4-hour intervals of sleep in the hotel room. "I know what this costs. I did it anyway." He looked at the floor. It was the first time in 9 years she had seen him look at the floor. She crossed the room. She walked past him to the door. She put her hand on the handle and paused. She looked back at him. One last time, the way you look at something you are choosing to leave behind. And she said the only thing left that was true and necessary. "My father saw you," she said. "He saw what you were. He spent the last months of his life trying to protect me from it, and he ran out of time." She felt the weight of that settle in her chest, the old grief and the new one layered together, inseparable. "He left me the evidence and trusted me to find it. I found it." She paused. "That's all." She opened the door. She walked out. In the staff corridor, she stopped and stood with her back against the wall for 30 seconds, hands flat against the cold plaster, breathing. Just breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she breathed when the patient was stable and the monitors were quiet, and the immediate emergency was resolved, and the particular aftermath of sustained crisis was moving through her body, looking for an exit. She walked back through the service corridor. Ruth Calloway was at the end of it, standing against the wall with a glass of water she handed to Sienna without comment. Sienna drank half of it. Ruth took it back. "Done?" Ruth asked. "Done." Ruth looked at her face. Whatever she saw there made her nod, once in the same way Greer had nodded and Marsh had nodded, the nod of someone who has been waiting for a particular thing to happen and is recognizing its arrival. "Your father would have," Ruth started. "Please don't," Sienna said. Not harshly, just without the capacity for that particular sentence right now. Ruth stopped, nodded again. "Go home," she said. Sienna almost said, "I don't have one." She stopped herself. She thought about what home meant now. The hotel room, the overnight bag, the journals in it, the thumb drive that had carried her father's last attempt to protect her. She thought about the apartment on the 53rd floor that had never been hers, and that she would not return to. She thought about home as a thing not yet rebuilt rather than a thing lost. She left the estate. She sat in the back of a car she'd arranged and watched Greenwich give way to the highway, and the highway give way to the bridge, and the bridge give way to the city, and the lights of it came up around her the way they always did when she came back, enormous and indifferent and entirely uninterested in what had happened to her, which was, she found, exactly what she needed. The investigations moved the way investigations move when the documentation is thorough and the timing is right, and the people who have been waiting for a sufficient body of evidence finally have one. Greer managed the legal dimensions. Sienna was deposed twice in the following 3 weeks. She answered every question with the same direct economy she'd used in the medical board hearing, and the financial crimes investigator, a woman named Danvers, who wore the same expression of exhausted competence in every meeting, told Greer after the second deposition that she was the clearest witness she'd deposed in 14 years of this work. Damien Voss was arrested on a Thursday morning outside his Midtown office. The charges were federal: financial fraud, money laundering, conspiracy. The arrest was not dramatic. She did not watch it happen. She read about it in 2 lines of a news alert while standing at the scrub sink before a 6-hour surgery, and she set her phone face down on the counter and turned on the water and let it run over her hands until the temperature was right. And then she went in and did her work. Marcus Whitfield was arrested 4 days later. 2 of the other men in the network negotiated cooperation agreements within the week. The structure that had operated for 20 years came apart with the specific rapid completeness of things that have been held together by silence rather than strength. The estate trust was frozen pending resolution of the fraud investigation. Greer told her, in their 3rd meeting after the arrest, that the amounts that had moved through Damien's proxy structure during the 2 years of the arrangement were significant but recoverable, that the assets her father had spent his life building were substantially intact, and that the process of extracting them from the contaminated structure would take time but would complete. She had listened to this and felt not the relief she'd expected, but a complicated grief, for the time her father had spent afraid of this outcome, for the months she had spent not opening the drive, for all the ways love and trust and willful blindness are sometimes indistinguishable from each other until they're not. Clara Whitmore was not arrested. Her cooperation statement and her testimony in the civil proceedings were sufficient to establish her as a witness rather than a co-conspirator in the fraud. though the professional consequences were significant and the personal ones more so. She lost her position at the hospital where she'd worked. She moved, Sienna was told by a mutual acquaintance 3 months later, to a city she'd never lived in before, which was, in its way, the only appropriate response to having burned every structure you'd built in the one you'd occupied. Sienna did not reach out to her. She did not close the door with finality either. She left it in the category of things that were true and unresolved and might remain that way, which was its own kind of honesty. She moved out of the hotel into a sublet in the West Village. A one-bedroom on a third floor with windows that faced east and morning light that came in at an angle that reminded her of the apartment she'd had in residency, the one she'd left when she married Damien, the one she'd given up without a backward glance because she trusted him and thought she was moving forward. The sublet had secondhand furniture and a kitchen too small for the serious cooking she occasionally attempted, and a building super named Vincent who fixed things without being asked and never made conversation, which she appreciated. She went back to work. She had never really left it, technically, but she went back to it now differently, with the specific quality of attention that comes when you have recently been reminded what it costs to lose something and have decided not to take what you have left for granted. She stood at the scrub sink and did her prep and walked into OR suites and put her hands inside the broken architecture of people's bodies and rebuilt what could be rebuilt, and the residents who rotated through her service noticed that she was more direct than before, less patient with procedural inefficiency, and more patient with genuine difficulty, and that she had the particular quality of stillness in a surgical emergency that communicated something not easily named but easily felt. That the person at the center of the table had been inside worse situations and knew something real about surviving them. Marsh stopped her in the corridor one evening, 6 weeks after the arrest. "You look better," he said. "I feel better." He nodded. He started to move away. Then he stopped and turned back. "For what it's worth, the way you handled the board hearing, the documentation, the testimony." He paused, finding the word. "Precise." She said, "I had a good teacher." He gave her a look that asked, "Who?" She just shook her head, and he moved on down the corridor, and she stood there for a moment before she understood that she meant her father, and that she hadn't quite meant to say it, and was glad she had. Nora took her to dinner on a Saturday in December, a place in the neighborhood, not the expensive kind, just good and honest and familiar. They ordered too much food and ate most of it, and talked about the hospital and a conference Nora was presenting at in the spring, and a book Sienna had started reading in the hotel and brought with her to the sublet and kept finding herself returning to in the evenings, which was not a habit she'd had in the marriage and which she was quietly building now. At some point in the middle of the meal, Nora put down her fork and looked at her and said, "Are you okay?" "Actually?" Sienna considered the question. She thought about actually. "I'm not what I was," she said. "I don't know yet what I am instead." Nora looked at her steadily. "That's usually a beginning." "I know." Sienna picked up her fork. "I'm working on it." She walked home through the West Village after dinner. December in the city, cold and lit and alive with the particular energy of a place that doesn't accommodate grief, but doesn't require you to perform its absence either. The streets she had walked for 15 years, the city that had watched her arrive and build and trust and lose and start the slow work of rebuilding without comment and without comfort and without ever once pretending it owed her either. She climbed the 3 flights to her sublet. She took off her coat. She made tea she didn't finish. She sat at the east-facing window in the dark and looked at the city below, the lights of it, the movement of it, the indifferent, enormous, alive fact of it. And she thought about her father. She thought about his hands, which had been a carpenter's hands before they were a businessman's hands, broad and precise and capable of making things that lasted. She thought about the drive he had pressed into her palm with the last of his strength, and the faith embedded in that gesture. Not faith in outcomes, not faith in systems, but faith in her specifically. In her particular capacity to survive what was coming and do something useful with the survival. She thought, "I opened it, Dad. I used it." She thought, "I'm sorry it took me so long." She sat with that for a while. The city did its city thing below her. The tea went cold. At some point, the grief and the exhaustion and the particular weight of everything the past several months had cost her settled into something quieter. Not resolved, not finished, but metabolized. The way grief eventually metabolizes if you let it move through you instead of building architecture around it to keep it contained. She was not the woman who had sat at a kitchen island 9 years ago and believed she had found the one place where she was safe. She was not the woman who had overheard 43 seconds of audio and understood, in the cold space between one breath and the next, that the safety had been a performance from the beginning. She was something that had come through both of those women and out the other side into territory she didn't have a map for yet. Unfinished, still in the process of becoming whatever the next chapter required. Tired in ways she was still discovering, and strong in ways she was still learning to trust. She was, she thought, exactly the kind of person her father had believed she would be when things got hard. She turned from the window. She picked up the cold tea and took it to the kitchen and poured it out. She turned off the light. She went to bed. Outside, the city continued its indifferent and relentless life, enormous and lit against the winter dark, and in a third-floor bedroom with east-facing windows, Sienna Vale closed her eyes and slept without dreaming, which was, after everything, enough.